Boxing Insider Radio.
How dare them even to challenge me, these fighters, with their primitive boxing skills. You know what I mean? They're as good as dead.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
It's about how much you can take and keep moving forward.
I wish I was 50 years younger and I'd kick your ass.
Boxing Insider Radio, bringing you the very best in boxing from around the world.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to BoxingInsider.com Radio in quarantine. I am the owner of BoxingInsider.com, Larry Goldberg, and I'm joined today by a true living legend, Hall of Fame boxing promoter, Bob Arum. We're going to be talking today about the coronavirus, how it's affecting boxing, and what needs to happen before he feels comfortable promoting fights again. Joining us now on the phone is Bob Arum. Bob, how are you?
Good.
How are you? How are you making out there in quarantine?
What are my alternatives?
Doing interviews like this.
Yeah, right. At least keep me occupied a little bit.
Well, I'm very interested to ask you. I was at the event that got canceled last minute at the Madison Square Garden event, and I was kind of wondering if you could kind of take us through what happened. It was originally going to have an event with no fans, then it was canceled. Can you kind of like take us through what happened that week?
What happened was that at first, obviously, we hoped to get the event in the normal manner. Then when we realized and we were told about no crowds and no events more than, first it was 250 and then 50, we said, okay, we will do all this and do it without spectators. And then we conferred with the New York Athletic Commission, and they said that they had talked to their doctors, and the real problem was that even if you did it without spectators, the fighters who participated would be at risk because they could give it to each other. And there were camera people and officials, referee, judges, and so forth. And without testing that got the results quickly, it would be putting people at risk to do it. And so on their recommendation, we canceled it. Remember, this was all in the beginning when we didn't know a lot of the situation. We didn't have the staying in place orders. We were really blindsided by this, and we didn't know ourselves how to deal with it. So obviously we followed the recommendations, and they were all just recommendations of the New York State Athletic Commission, and we canceled the event. And subsequently, that turned out to be the proper procedure, and other state commissions and states followed suit. But that was it. Our first hope was to get the event on, and then when we realized, and we were going blind because we had no experience dealing with this, that wasn't good enough. Because it still jeopardized a significant number of people, we canceled the event.
Now, you mentioned testing. Is that pretty much what's going to stand in the way from when we actually relaunch boxing, whenever that may be, the proper and quick testing for everybody involved?
That is correct. And that is, in order to reopen the country, just forget about sports, but to reopen the country, it is unquestionably important that as many people as possible get tested. Now, if you had a test that could bring, and you could get results in 15 minutes, and there are tests now, and you get it widely circulated so you weren't taking it away from people in need, then you could test all the participants at the weigh-in and all the participants again the night of the fight. And if you did that, you could then proceed with events without spectators, without jeopardizing anybody who was participating in the event. Now, there is a further problem. And the further problem is that if you did that, what happens if a fighter was injured? And that happens a lot. And he went to a hospital. Then are you taking up needed bed space? If there are adequate number of beds for hospital patients, including coronavirus patients, then that's not a problem. And then what about ambulances? You have to have ambulances at the event. Are there sufficient ambulances to transport any fighter who was injured in a fight to the hospital? All of those issues are complex and have to be worked out before you can willy-nilly talk about doing an event without spectators and think that that's all you have to do. And that's a lesson that was learned by the UFC. I mean, they had every intention of doing an event without spectators, but they didn't look more deeply into problems that were there. And therefore, they had to cancel the event.
Well, you actually touched on two of my next questions, so let me first ask, are you looking at when boxing relaunches that you're going to be doing events without fans?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're looking to do events initially without spectators, and to do them in a manner approved by the applicable athletic commission, and to make sure that all steps were being taken that wouldn't jeopardize the rest of the population. By that I mean that has to be done in communities where there's not a problem with hospital beds, lack of hospital beds, and where ambulances are available to take a participant who is injured to a hospital. So all of that stuff has to, and there's adequate testing. So we're working on that as we speak with various commissions, such as the Nevada Commission and the California Commission, and they are consulting. They're great people, Bob Bennett and Andy Foster, the respective executive directors of the commissions, and they are conferring with health officials. So when we're up and running, we do it right, and we're protecting the health and safety of the fighters, the health and safety of the participants, and we're being responsible citizens.
So do you think that when you actually do have fights again in front of a fan, say at like Madison Square Garden, that you're going to have to space people out like every other seat, or have you given that any thought? Because that's a big revenue stream for you and some of the undercard fighters is selling tickets.
Look, I'm not a doctor, and I'm even though I talk like him, I'm not Anthony Fauci. I mean, that was questions for people of his status, not for me. If we had to do that, space people, if that became required, then we would do it. The point is we're citizens of this country, and we're going to act responsibly, and we're going to be directed by competent medical professionals.
Now, you mentioned the UFC. Now, you obviously have a deal with ESPN, and the articles that came out about the UFC event being canceled was Dana said that he got a call from very high up at ESPN and Disney Did you see this coming? What are your thoughts as far as him trying to do fights? Was his heart in the right spot? But what do you think about all that?
ESPN and Disney are responsible citizens of our country and of the state of California. And they were advised, as I understand it, based on the New York Times story, by the governor of California, that this event, although on tribal land, question of jurisdiction, should not take place because it jeopardized the citizens of California. And on that basis, I believe Disney and ESPN contacted the UFC and told them to pull down the event. I think that was appropriate, that ESPN and Disney, or good citizens, acted accordingly based on a request from the governor of California. Now, as far as Dana White is concerned, he is of a completely different political persuasion from the one I'm in. And I think that a lot of people who think like him tend to minimize the risk from coronavirus. And therefore, I think that what he was doing, I look at it as being irresponsible. But he looks at it, well, we have to get back to normal, and I can't wait to get back to normal, so I'm going to take it into my own hands. Well, I disagree with that, but again, I'm not going to attack his motives. He obviously thinks a lot differently from the way I would, and people in my company do.
Well, the Wall Street Journal had an article earlier this week about the UFC event, and they said that Dana's motivation had to do with his ESPN contract, that he had to put on a certain number of fights. I believe it was 42, in order for him to get his contractual money from ESPN. So my question is Top Rank in a similar position? Yes, absolutely we are. We're in an identical situation because our contracts are, I believe, similar as far as our output. But again, the way you deal with that situation is once things open up and you can responsibly do events with or without spectators, you put on 3-4 events in a week. I mean, particularly that so many of the events not only to ESPN, but to the streaming ESPN Plus. They have infinite bandwidth, and therefore you can do many events. So we will catch up. We will do all the events that we are required to do by ESPN, and I'm sure the UFC will do the same thing. But again, the solution is not to rush events when we're in the situation we're in now, but to figure out how we're going to make up and stage those events when we're able to in a responsible manner. Is it going to be cost effective for Top Rank and all these other promotions to keep as many fighters under contract in the short term at the very least?
Well, again, the fighters and the fight managers are intelligent people, and they're going to want to participate. They're in a worse position from what we're in because an athlete has a limited time period when he can perform at a high level, and a promotion company, I'm in my over 50 years, so an athlete is 10, 15 years at best. So an athlete, he or her has to get back into action. And it may very well be that everybody will have to adjust their financial needs and to get these events done. athletes will have to probably take more money, less money than they made when they performed before full arenas. I mean, that's natural. I mean, there's going to be an adjustment in all sports.
Well, keeping the boxing, let me ask you about the DAZN. They're very boxing-centric, and they've seemed like they've paused boxing for at least the next 3 months. But unlike ESPN Plus, the DAZN doesn't have as much compelling content to keep the subscription. Do you think that is this going to hurt the DAZN, or how is this going to affect them, in your opinion?
Well, remember, the DAZN is different depending on the country they originate from. In Germany, their subscriptions are really fueled by soccer. They have the Bundesliga, which is the German soccer league, the Premier League from England. Right now, obviously, people are unsubscribing because they're not getting those games, but those games will come back, and they'll be in good shape because they have contracts with those leagues. Like in Japan, they have a contract with Major League Baseball from the U.S. because the Japanese networks don't have the bandwidth to do all of Major League Baseball, and that'll come back to Japan, and they'll be fine. In the United States, they have relied almost completely on combat sports, whether it was boxing and to a lesser extent MMA with Bellator. So they're going to have to rethink what they've done in the United States, what they're doing, and either go out and attempt to get more sports to go with the boxing, or to spend less on most of the boxing they do and have a couple of tentpole events like those of a Canelo fight, or to a lesser extent the Golovkin fight, and do it that way. But they have to do a lot of rethinking, and obviously when there's nothing for them to show, there's no reason for them to keep operating and keeping all the people that they have on payroll.
And what about the PBC?
Well, PBC is in the same position as Top Rank, and once everything opens up, they will supply fight events and fights to Fox and to FS1, the Fox Sports station, and also to Showtime. So they've done the right thing by shutting down, and then they will have to decide when to go back into action. And like everybody else, they'll probably have to do events without spectators, and they'll have to adjust the purses that they pay their fighters. But PBC and PBC and Top Rank are in virtually the same position.
Now, you guys had a successful co-promotion with the Wilder Fury fight. Would you guys consider having that rematch in front of no spectators, or where does that fight fall into all this when everything gets restarted up again?
I don't know how you could do that event without spectators, because the gate is such a big proportion of the event. The gate, I think, was $17 million, or almost $17 million for their last fight. And how do you replace that money? So we'd have to sit down, and we will sit down with PBC people and determine when we can do that event. But based on our preliminary discussions with them, I think we all agreed that we would have to wait for a time when we could do it for spectators.
So when boxing does return to normalcy, what fights would be your biggest priority to make?
Well, there's a lot of great fights. There's Lomachenko and Lopez that we were doing. There's Crawford and Spence that we can do with PBC. Valdez was supposed to fight for Schelt. We had a lot of great fights on our card, on our schedule, as did PBC. And we're going to have to gear up. And I think we're going to have to sit down and figure out maybe we can do more fights together so that we could have ESPN and Fox collaborating on those fights. We had a good experience with PBC and with Fox on the Tyson Fury Wilder fight. And because we all had a good experience and we worked well together, that augurs well for the future.
Well, that's great to hear. So you're definitely looking to co-promote more fights with the PBC, because that's definitely been a criticism that the fans have given with boxing splitting up into all these different groups.
Well, we had a bad experience with them on the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight, even though that was a very successful event. But it was agony doing that event.
Why so?
And we just didn't get along, and everything was spiteful. I don't know. That's the past. And
but now everything is going good, is what you're saying.
But now everything, we had an event where everything went well, and everybody worked together in a collegial manner, and that augurs well for the future. So I don't want to go back and dwell on who was wrong and who was right in the prior event.
Now, there was a lot of piracy in that event, and apparently that had really hurt the pay-per-view buys. Are you guys going to look to do something to kind of curb that in the future, or what are your feelings on that?
Fox and ESPN were both working on the piracy problem. Piracy is a major, major problem, not only for a pay-per-view event, but for streaming services and so forth. And we're going to figure out, we'll come up with a way to really eliminate or virtually eliminate piracy. For us, piracy is coronavirus in doing events. Very, very tough to deal with, but we'll find a way.
Now, the other night on ESPN, you guys aired a bunch of really cool old fights. Are you guys in talks with them about going through your library and just, giving us a lot of, classic content in the meantime?
Yes, sure, that we're doing that. We have, unbelievable content to give them, and they've taken us up on it. I think they're going to do. They did Hagler Leonard, and we got all these great Hagler fights and Leonard fights, and fights with De La Hoya, with Mayweather. So I just hope that. I hope this is over soon and we're doing live fights. But meanwhile, I think showing these fights demonstrates to the public what a great sport boxing has been and is currently. And it just reminds them of the great glory days when they were young people and they watched these events with their fathers.
Now, are you going to wait to do fights in America, or would you consider doing fights in another country if this drags out?
Certainly, we're looking for America because it's going to take time before air travel gets back to normal, where countries let foreign nationals come in to fight to come into the countries. So obviously, we want to start with fights in America. The UK and places like that have their own problems. And before we start dealing with our fighters fighting abroad, we have to figure out how they can be able to fight in the United States. All of these are obvious problems, and they have to be solved, and you just can't solve them off the top of your head. You got to figure out how best you'll solve them based on the global world that we live in. So, yeah, eventually we want to do fights abroad. That's great. That helps boxing and everything. But when we're going to be able to do it, I wouldn't know.
Well, going back to Crawford versus Spence, what would need to happen, or going back a month or two ago, to have made that fight? Would it be as simple as a 50-50 split, or why wasn't that fight able to be made, or could that fight have been made, or maybe even closer than any of us even knew?
Well, the fight wasn't made because we were still had the bitter experience of Mayweather-Pacquiao fight, where the companies didn't work well together.
But now you're good friends.
And then when we started doing the Fury-Wilder second fight and started getting along, we did discuss Spence and Crawford, and then Spence had that terrible accident, and we cut off conversation. And then once we did the Wilder Fury fight at the end of February, the coronavirus situation really struck in early March, and so that terminated any talk about doing an event. I mean, you couldn't do it a Crawford-Spence fight in the face of the situation that exists today in this country regarding coronavirus.
Well, I personally originally heard about the coronavirus because we were all talking about going to China for your event in February that got postponed because of that. So you guys, it come up on your radar, definitely before it came up on anyone else's.
Yeah, it came up on our radar, but originally when we canceled the event, we canceled it because the virus had spread out of Wuhan, where it started, and had reached the Hunan Island where the fight was going to be held, and to Macau and places like that. And we realized that there was an epidemic in China that we wouldn't want to subject the fighters to, our television people, any of us who would participate in that event. And we called up to sponsor really lovely people in China who had the hotels and the facilities that wanted to do the event. And we told them that we were canceling it. And they said, thank you so much, because 50% of our reservations had already canceled. So at that particular point, we pulled it down. Jose Ramirez was going to leave that night to fly to China, and Postal and Freddie Roach were already there in China. We had to bring them back. So we didn't realize at that time, because, I mean, we're not medical experts. We didn't understand this virus. We didn't realize at that time that how the virus would spread out of China. Well, we did. We didn't want to jeopardize our people by going to China and contracting the virus.
Well, anyway, Bob, I wanted to, before we finish this interview, I wanted to ask you a little bit about Tyson Fury. And what do you think about him potentially fighting Anthony Joshua, possibly doing the WWE again? And then finally, I want to ask you about singing American Pie after the fight.
Well, as far as doing WWE again, we encourage it because we're very friendly with Vince McMahon and his operation, which is first class, and we work together, and we think that Tyson Fury enhances his popularity by performing in WWE events. They're first class people. So we encourage that. We think that's good. Particularly, it looks like they'll be able to do events also without spectators in their facility in Orlando. So I think that's good. As far as Tyson Fury fighting Joshua, well, he has an obligation first to fight Wilder again, and Joshua has an obligation to fight Pula. If once those fights happen, I would love to have Tyson Fury fight Anthony Joshua. We on the Fury side have no problem dealing with Joshua and his promoter Eddie Hearn, and we'll be able to put that fight together, I believe, pretty quickly once the respective fighters have fought Pula for Joshua and Wilder for Fury. So, I'm optimistic that fight will happen next year.
So I have to ask you, I was at this event that you had about a year or so ago at Madison Square Garden with you and Don King. And Don was standing on the stage giving his whole spiel, and he started going on and on and on about how you were screwing him out of the per diems. And I watched you, and you turned to the person next to you, and you go, what is he talking about with the per diem? So I've always been wanting to know, what was he talking about with the per diems that day?
You have to ask him. I don't know what the hell he was talking about. I really don't know.
I mean, he spent a good 5 minutes on that.
Yeah, because he has nothing else to say. What is he going to talk about? His buddy Donald Trump? So he talked about the per diems. I don't know what the hell he was talking about. Each of his fighters and each of his staff, we give them per diem the same amount. I don't know what the hell he was talking about.
Well, Bob, I really appreciate you coming on the show today, and it was really an honor getting a chance to talk to you about some of this stuff.
All right, good talking to you. At least give me something to do during the day.
Oh, we would definitely love to have you back, and I appreciate Evan.
Okay. All right, this is a good time. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Good talking to you.
Good talking to you.
Keep well.
You
Keep
too.
safe.
Thank you very much.
Stay up to date with all things Boxing Insider at boxinginsider.com and across all social.
It's fact. I'm the best. You know what I mean? Sometimes I don't want to believe it myself, but it's the truth. I'm the best.
Until next week's fight, go to your premier boxing destination, boxinginsider.com.